Contact itself is a major topic in sociolinguistics. There are contact studies. There is even a branch of linguistics called contact linguistics. Contact is a broad term that may refer to language contact or dialect contact. When do you have a contact situation? The contact situation occurs when people of different languages or dialects come into contact with each other geographically, in the sense that they live in neighboring locations or areas or social proximity. They may not live next to each other, but in social interactions, a certain group of people from a particular linguistic dialectal background would come into contact with another social group. If you have watched my videos from before, you know that there is another term that can cover both language and dialect, and that term is variety. Why is it important to talk about language contact? You would say, of course, people of different language varieties come into contact. The point is, once contact occurs, there is a host of other things that may follow the contact situation. Contact situation may result in things like code switching and code mixing, which we talked about in earlier videos. They code switch between at least two languages because they speak those two languages. And why do they speak those two languages? Probably because they were put in a situation where those two languages came into contact. But there's more. When languages come into contact, they affect each other. They influence each other. Language contact can result, and it often does result, directly in changes in language structures. Language contact can go so far as to result in language death, which means that some people, when they come into contact with another language, which is probably more dominant, may gradually lose their own language by adopting the new language as their main means of communication. In other words, they adopt the dominant language at the expense of their own language. Two or more languages are said to be in contact if they are used alternatively by the same person. In other words, when the same person uses two languages alternatively, that person is called a bilingual, and that situation is called bilingualism. Interestingly, you would think that language contact takes place when two languages come into contact, but you need to know that, although that is true, the real language contact takes place inside the individual. The location or the locus of contact is not outside the individual, it's in the mind of the bilingual. It's in your mind that those two languages come into contact. It's not in society. This is a very philosophical view. When bilinguals, being familiar with more than one language and resulting in language contact, there will be a phenomenon called interference. Interference is the rearrangement of patterns of a language as a result of the introduction of foreign elements. Foreign in the sense of foreign to that language. The greater difference between the two linguistic systems involved, the greater is the learning problem and the potential area of interference. These mechanisms of interference are regardless of what languages are involved. It could be French and Chinese, it could be two different varieties of the English language. There are many phenomena that occur as a result of language contact. These could include borrowing words from another language, which creates loan words. Loan translations, you don't borrow the words, you borrow the semantic structure. Language convergence, pidgins, creoles, and last but not least, code switching and code mixing. During language contact, a lot of times one language has dominant role over the other. However, you need to know that even in dominant situations, the influence is usually not one way. Even the dominant language adopts certain elements. It could be lexical elements, borrowing words from the other language. An interesting example of this is the Spanish language in Mexico, which became the dominant language at the expense of indigenous languages. But there are a lot of words in the Spanish language that have been borrowed from indigenous Mexican languages. Some of them have been even passed into English, like chocolate, chocolatl, and avocado. aguacatl, tomato, tomatl. And this is other than all those place names that are in Mexico, which are still, like a lot of them from Nahuatl. Mexican people who speak even exclusively Spanish, they can pronounce these indigenous words very well. I wonder if you're a Spanish speaker not from Mexico and you have not been historically in contact with these indigenous languages, how well you can pronounce these words. And if you personally have a comment on that, I would be more than glad to read those comments. This is an interesting situation because this is a situation of historical contact between indigenous languages in Mexico and the Spanish language. Fortunately enough, there are still tens of indigenous languages which are still spoken. They have native speakers in Mexico. And that brings us to another situation of language contact which is taking place in Mexico, but not exclusively in Mexico. When you have a situation in which the speakers of one language have more power over the speakers of the other language, you have a situation of linguistic hegemony. Throughout the world and its history, there have been major languages around the world that have experienced periods of linguistic hegemony. These languages include, but probably are not limited to, Greek, Latin, Chinese, Persian, Portuguese, French, Spanish, Arabic, Sanskrit, Russian, German, and English. These languages historically have been in a position of linguistic hegemony in the sense that the speakers of these languages have had, in terms of political power, were in a dominant situation and they influence other languages. In some cases, some of these languages which were dominant at some point were dominated by other languages. For example, in the case of Persian, it has been dominated by Arabic throughout centuries, although in turn it dominated other languages in other settings. So linguistic hegemony is a situation of near exclusively one-way influence of one language over the other. But as I said, even in linguistic hegemony, situations of linguistic hegemony, the weaker language influences the dominant language in certain ways. English itself has been heavily influenced by other languages. Although right now you could say that English has a dominant role throughout the world internationally and is influencing languages across the world. English and Persian historically influenced the languages of India. But within India, there are languages who have a dominant role in relation to other Indian languages. For example, Hindi is a very dominant language now, and there are smaller languages in India which might be in a weaker relationship in interaction with Hindi. But here we are. Hopefully, a lot of comments based on your experiences of language contact